Hello, everyone. Let's get the energy up a little bit. You are in the best fireside chat room. I'm a little biased, but this is the best fireside chat room. It might be the only fireside chat room, but it's still the best. So I think this is going to be a great session. It's a topic I'm very interested in. As a engineer whose code no longer ends up in production, my favorite kind of code to write is the code I don't have to write. Code that someone else wrote and I can use their Compose library, install it. It's great. That comes with some risks, and that's what these three awesome experts are here to talk to us about today. So please help me welcome to the stage Emilio Escobar, Dustin Ingram, André Arko. Emilio is the CISO here at Datadog. Dustin is a staff software engineer at Google and maintainer of Pipi. And André Arko is head of open source at Ruby Central and works at RubyGems.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, don't forget to scan the QR code and submit your questions for Q&A at the end.
Yeah, so thanks Austin, thank you, Brandon, and thank you, Dustin and Andre, for being with us. So we wanted to discuss this topic. It's very top of mind for a lot of people. It's in the news. We were just talking about this recent article that just came out today about NPM specifically. So we figured like this will be a good topic for the audience that comes to Dash, and hopefully people walk away with a little something out of it. But maybe we can get started with kind of talking about defining the problem itself. So from a what is supply chain risk? If you're a developer or a DevOps person, like what does that mean to you? I don't know who wants to start with that.
Go for it. I'll take a shot at it. Yeah. So yeah, like Brandon said, like all the software we built is built on top of other software, right? And so by using that software, you have this implicit trust that it is going to do what you want it to do, right? And no one has the capacity or resources to audit every single piece of software that they consume as like a third-party dependency or service or whatever it might be. It might not even be possible to do that. So supply chain security is, I think, more about taking steps to mitigate those risks as much as possible, balancing those steps to mitigate with like your actual ability and resources and potential impact if a problem were to occur.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I feel like it's maybe even worth pointing out that even if you have functionally infinite resources, you do audit all of your dependencies, you're probably still missing stuff. And so it doesn't free you from needing to set up risk mitigation no matter what resource size you're operating at. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because when I think like when a lot of people hear supply chain security, they automatically think about vulnerabilities within the dependencies and fixing those vulnerabilities and asking the developers to like, hey, use this version instead of that. But I think it's much more than just that. Can we talk about like what are actual when we think about supply chain security itself, like what are the links of that supply chain that I think people should be aware of?
Sure. Yeah, I think on the I guess like the kind of like cascade of stuff that on the Ruby side software is built on top of. It's not just kind of security vulnerabilities like you were saying, but it's also like the set of deliberate vendors and kind of like accidental vendors and random hobbyists who did something that was convenient for you, you're all now kind of like mutually trusting each other. Right. And that's much like more relevant, I think, than, oh, someone found a security vulnerability and we upgraded to the next version of that package. It's like, well, I guess like the kind of like trivial example that I like to use because it illustrates the point really well is like you use a Chrome extension that's really handy. Maybe it's an ad blocker, and maybe that ad blocker gets sold to someone else, and now it's full of malware, and now it's like reading your credit card numbers. And that's not a security vulnerability, right? It's like you installed a new version, and like the supply chain wasn't secure, right? And that's kind of like I don't know, that's like my metaphor that I try and use to kind of like get across, like it's not, security vulnerabilities and upgrades aren't exactly the problem that supply chain security is trying to address.
Yeah. I think it's also about like following these things back upstream too, right? Like every open source library that you use is built on top of other open source libraries. And so like that build process, you have to be able to trust that that's happened in a way that what you're consuming, even if you're consuming it totally safely, that hasn't been compromised in some way,
Yeah.
right? Or
Yeah.
the platform or whatever, wherever the build is happening, and on further and further deep into the stack of turtles.
Yeah, but it's also, the ecosystem also contains, it has different touch points, right? So like, for this recent article, for example, it was a CDN attack to a CDN provider that hosts NPM packages, was attacked to then host a malicious version of an already existing NPM package, but then you have humans that contribute to that packages whose account might be compromised, right? I think we see somewhere the maintainer of a package had an email with a custom domain and that domain expired so there's so many different touch points. So to your point, when you think about supply chain security, it's not just a vulnerability, it's way more than that. So for the audience perspective, or even for my own education, for PyPI and RubyGems, what's the scale? Like how many packages, if you know the number off the top of your head, or an estimate that ecosystem is composed of?
Like how many total non-malicious things?
Yeah.
I mean, there's more than 500,000 packages on PyPI, but when we're talking about like security risks, right? I think there's a gradient that you have to think about. There's this stuff that's like incredibly common and very low impact, right? Like generally not going to be a risk to you, and the stuff that's like extremely uncommon but extremely high impact.
Right.
And that's what actually keeps me up at night, right? So all the stuff you hear about RDoS vulnerabilities and like even honestly malware on PyPI, you're only going to get compromised by that if you're like in a Discord channel for cryptocurrency and they tell you to pip install like pip special color package, right? That's probably malware. The stuff that you're installing day to day is probably not going to end up being malware. So I think like being able to balance between those two ends of the spectrum and sort of make decisions based on, how likely is this going to be a problem for me is really important to take into consideration here.
Yeah, absolutely. The RubyGems ecosystem is like on the order of about 1 million packages, and we serve like something on the order of a few billion copies of those packages every month to something like 10 million unique clients. IP addresses aren't exactly people, but it's the best thing we have. I think like the closest kind of like situation, like maybe the most alarming situation that we've had lines very well with what we were describing, where one of the maintainers of a like medium popular package let his custom domain expire and somebody registered the domain and reset his password. I guess now that I'm saying this out loud, it might have been a Gmail account and they just like managed to find his password in a dump from another site. Anyway, the maintainer's account got compromised and they started publishing new versions of this legitimate gem, but just with some malware added that they didn't put in the GitHub repo.
Right.
And so then it depends on like a different set of kind of like checks where we actively scan the contents of packages and we're like, hey, wait a second, this looks really sketchy to notice.
And I know we've kind of focused on that offensive security aspect that people can do, but supply chain, I think even the security of it even from a reliability standpoint also has some repercussions.
Absolutely.
Wasn't there, I believe it was a Node.js package that a bunch of different packages dependent on.
There were at least 3, but you're probably thinking of LeftPad.
That the maintainer decided to just be like, screw it, I'm done with it, and then everything else started breaking. So it's not just the security, right? It's also that dependency in a whole ecosystem itself.
Once it's gone, then what do you do?
Right.
Yeah.
One thing that I'm sure the audience will be interested as volunteers for these projects, so PyPI, RubyGems, how are you thinking about for your own ecosystem? Like what is PyPI thinking about or what it's doing? Same thing with RubyGems, right? Like how do you think about this? And also, maybe even for me, this is probably more a me question. How do you keep up with the scale? Right? Like how does that work?
Yeah, it's hard. So PyPI is a project.
It's a big struggle.
Yeah, PyPI is a project with the Python Software Foundation, which is a nonprofit, and so the service is basically run by volunteers, which is kind of incredible when you compare it to something like NPM, which is run by a massive corporation, right? So there's a lot, and actually it's interesting what André was getting at with the domain takeover for a maintainer account. We had a similar thing happen with PyPI, and it's an incredibly time-consuming thing to ask volunteers to do. It's like respond to this, write the advisory, share comms, all that kind of stuff around that. So we try to minimize that. And so our strategy generally is to minimize impact to users and also minimize the amount of support and resources we have to put into potential issues, right? So one thing that we have been pushing for, I know GitHub's pushing for, I don't know if RubyGems announces, we're going to require 2FA for all accounts that push code to PyPI by the end of the year. And this is going to be, great for end users, but also great for us because it means there's going to be less opportunities for like password takeover or account takeover based on password reuse and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. I think so RubyGems has supported 2FA optionally for I think longer, and so we have kind of like awareness of the balance of that, where like, sure, requiring 2FA means that it's less likely that accounts will get taken over, but requiring 2FA as a hard requirement means that people who have no idea how to keep track of 2FA credentials will need them, and then they will lose them, and then they will send messages to support to get their account unlocked, and that dramatically increases the burden on our volunteers, or sometimes we're able to pay folks out of Ruby Central, very similar kind of situation. There's a nonprofit that kind of like tries to coordinate budget to coordinate volunteers, to pay those volunteers sometimes, but like it's not like we have the budget to even have like one single full-time developer on this yet.
Right.
And so in that context, the idea of, oh, okay, do we throw the big switch to require 2FA for every login and every gem push, and then like probably 10x our support burden is like a much harder like thing.
Yeah. And so at Datadog, we produce software that our customers install via some of these repositories as well. But maybe and correct me if I'm misspeaking here, but I believe the majority of these packages that the entire ecosystem depends on is also written by volunteers as well. And this is an unscripted question, so bear with me. But curious, have you, when you think about 2FA and additional controls for these projects, you mentioned you have to keep the balance, right? Because at the end of the day, they're your end users as well, just like any security team at any company trying to say, okay, now we're going to do 2FA for all employees. Have you heard of or had direct conversations with, say, maintainers of popular packages and hear like what their perspectives are with this whole thing?
I have firsthand experience with this. So PyPI partnered with Google, who I also work for obviously, to provide security keys for maintainers of critical packages so they could adopt 2FA. So we had set up this whole thing and this announcement, we publicized it, and people flipped out. And the reason was because we did kind of bad comms with it, but the other was really, any security change you want to make or get people to adopt is going to require some change or some additional branding. You can do a lot of work to minimize that, but it's still going to be something you have to do. And the premise is asking maintainers to do anything else besides what they're already doing is a lot, right? Because they're spending a lot of time maintaining things already.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the pieces of pushback that we got in the Ruby community is that there are some projects that are really widely used that are functionally just like someone's fun hobby. And this may not stay true now that Shopify is paying some developers to implement alternatives, but the main Ruby library just for parsing Ruby code, if you want to write Ruby that knows how to parse Ruby code, it's literally someone's hobby project. And they basically said it's 60% of Ruby projects that interact with Ruby code as an AST depend on my hobby project because it's one of the best options. Right. And because it's my hobby project, if you enforce 2FA, I will just stop publishing updates because it's my hobby project and I don't want to deal with the ceremony of keeping track of a 2FA token that I have to provide every time I push a new version. It's just too much work for me. I'll be done.
Wow.
So that's also a very real concern.
Yeah. I would imagine, in another unscripted question, it's with the rollout of maybe easier to use but more secure authentication methods could be a potential solution, like passkeys, for example.
So we have actually rolled out passkeys,
Nice. Okay.
and initially just as a 2FA factor, right? So you can opt into passkeys instead of OTP tokens if you want. But yeah, I'm really hopeful that if we can ship passkeys as a viable option instead of passwords at all. And we're also working on some trusted publishing stuff like what Python has shipped recently that will allow fully automated kind of short-lived tokens so that you're not putting a real API key into GitHub or whatever that give you automated publishing with similar high levels of security, but without you having to like sit there and put your 6-digit code into GitHub Actions.
Yeah.
Combining all of those things, I'm hopeful that we can kind of like negotiate our way to a less burdensome but significantly more secure eventual result.
Yeah, the trusted publishing, I'm glad you brought that up because that's actually an example of something that you can adopt to make publishing more secure, but also makes things a lot easier.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, I remember reading that announcement, and even for some of the open source stuff that I do is using those short-lived tokens is much easier. Curious, actually, and then we'll move on to the scripted questions. Is supply chain, like we talked about, has a different dimensions, right? So you have the Project 6 store, for example, right? You have all these other methods for great, RubyGems and PyPI. Now I'm protecting my account as a maintainer. Now I'm publishing a package there. How can I actually allow people to verify that that package is generally the package that they should install? Is that something that both projects are working on directly with, like, say, Sixstore and others, or does it still feel like they're doing their own thing and you guys are sort of benefiting from it? Like, what is that ecosystem like right now?
So I'd say, there's a couple levels. Like you said, the goal is to verify that what you're installing is what you wanted to install. There's a couple of ways to do this, right? And there's a couple of ways to interpret that. One is like, if you just look at the hash of the file that you're installing, is that sufficient, right? A lot of people aren't just doing that. People aren't doing hash pinning. So that alone like gets you 90% of the way there of like, okay, this is the thing I saw a long time ago. I'm still installing the exact same thing. But then there's other steps like trying to understand, okay, like who had the ability to publish to the registry where I got this artifact and the hash from? Or like, where did that come from? Where did the artifact that was published there, where did that come from upstream? Was it built in a GitHub repository, or was it built on someone's laptop, and maybe that laptop was an attacker-owned thing, right? So I think sort of increasing the ability to expand the way that you verify those artifacts when you install them is kind of generally the goal, and what people should sort of think about, okay, what steps can I take to further verify that this is actually what I intended to install?
Absolutely, and I think exactly like Dustin was saying, it's kind of like this enormous hierarchy of kind of like sub-verifications, right? Like, and something that we have a giant list of that we are like slowly punching our way down as we're able to find folks who are interested in supporting that work. And right, exactly like he was saying, like, we check the checksums of all the packages that you installed into your lock file so that then everyone who ever installs that package again knows that they're getting the same package. That's like a fundamental core principle of Bundler as the application dependency manager, right? You should be getting the same package and the same code everywhere you ever use this again for all time. Every server, every developer, you should always be the same code. And then it's like, okay, well, like, is this the same code that the developer pushed to the repository? And that's the problem that like Sigstore is working on, that kind of like connection from maintainer creating the package to you getting the package the first time.
It's a whole provenance check, right? Exactly.
Right, exactly. And then there's like the, kind of like linking that back to the actual source code itself. Like, did what the maintainer built actually come from this thing that you can see somewhere? Or was there like, I guess exactly like that malware case I was mentioning before, where like the GitHub repo still doesn't have any malware in it, but the developer was like, new version.
Yeah.
And so it's like a whole set of additional, kind of like complicated pieces of infrastructure that need to be built to add all of these additional levels of assurance. But in theory, once we get them all built, then everyone benefits from them automatically. And so that's actually a big thing that we are effectively trying to figure out, right, is like, this is a lot of work. We have had the update framework, which is like a subset of the Sigstore verification promises.
Yeah.
Like, we have had that on our list of, we would really like to do this for literally 10 years. And it turns out that even after 10 years, like, we just haven't found somebody willing to support developers to do that large of an amount of work. Right. They're like, it works good enough, right? Like,
yeah. So we have one of the co-authors of Tough works for us, and we've been using Tough for parts of iAgent, and it was quite a bit of an engineering investment to get there. So I completely understand the challenges of getting an ecosystem with developers to do that on their own.
Right.
It's pretty difficult. I think this is what Sixstore is trying to do, to try to simplify it through like GitHub Actions and things like that. So I'm super excited to see more of that. But if I'm looking at, okay, great, you know, I have all these services, or I build all these things in my company, or I'm supposed to secure all these things in my company, how do I even get started in this whole supply chain? I'm reading it in the news, my boss is asking me about it all the time. How do you start working in this problem?
So in Alexi's keynote, at one point he was talking about security and observability being kind of two sides of the same coin, and I think that's something to think about. Like, you know, being able to answer the question, what third-party stuff do I have in production right now? Like, if I told you right now that, oh, this thing on PyPI is compromised, can you determine if you're using it or not? If you're not hash pinning, if you're not version pinning, that kind of thing, you might not be able to. Can you go back in time and figure out if you'd ever used it, right? Being able to answer those kind of questions, which are like pretty easily solved with log files, right? Is I think a step in the, you know, maybe the first step in the right direction. And also, like, it's something that a lot of people aren't doing. Like, I'm very surprised to find that lots of people don't do that today. They just install the latest version and are happy with it.
Yep. And that's actually, in some ways, this makes me like feel really good about kind of like pushing the state of the art forward. Like, I was part of the team that initially built and launched Bundler way back in like 2010 or whatever. And at that time, like literally the idea of a lock file was controversial. Like, there was a huge amount of pushback. Like, why do you want to do this? This is so much more work. This is so much more difficult. Like, all of my workflows have now been broken because you insist on doing these ridiculous things. And now, today, like, every Ruby project has a lock file. And so it is possible to both know immediately now, today, do I depend on this thing with a problem? And did I in the past? Because the lock file is in your repo, and you CI didn't pass unless you checked in the lock file that had the right packages in it, as kind of like a fundamental unit of using Ruby packages, which is very cool. So on the Ruby side, I would say, like, unless you're actively deleting your lock file, which would be a lot more work, you're probably good on that. But the next step that I would suggest after that is integrating a kind of like auditing tool into your CI. So like, there's a tool called Bundle Audit that kind of like builds on top of Bundler to say like, hey, is anything in this lock file known to have a problem? And it uses a database that like automatically pulls in and updates every known security issue in the Ruby ecosystem. And so you can find out that you need to upgrade a gem via your CI failing because there's a security issue with a gem that you've been locked to.
So it's interesting, right? Because the problem seems like it's a pretty large problem to think about. But it seems like getting started, there are very easy steps to do that, right? Like pin your versions, run the audits during part of your CI. But we still see some of that not being practiced. I actually wonder, since you work on the bundler, is there, even from an audit perspective, are you guys thinking about saying like, hey, you're asking for these dependencies, but you haven't pinned a version of them, to kind of bring on more awareness of that practice?
So the way that, excuse me, Bundler does it in kind of like a tiered way, which is, it has like some similarities and differences to the way that Python does it. But fundamentally, the way that you end up doing it in Bundler is you say, I would just like this. And you are allowed to say like greater than this or less than this, or add whatever constraints you want. But in the end, if you tell Bundler to install it, it serializes a fully locked, concrete version of everything. And so unless you actively work at it by deleting the file after Bundler creates it, you're just going to have a record. And that's kind of like again, after literally years of arguing on the internet with people about this, the Ruby community kind of coalesced around the idea that lock files are good, actually. And so there's been probably like, I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 10 years of the Ruby community just like assuming as a baseline that everyone has a lock file and everyone knows the exact versions that they're using and reuses those same exact versions everywhere.
We're still arguing in the Python
Yeah,
community.
no, I totally understandable. Like it was a good 5 years of like extremely like vicious knockdown, drag out, like someone is wrong on the internet fights over bundler, and it was the only tool at the time, right? There was no like which of these 5 tools is best. The options were bundler or no bundler, and it still took 4 or 5 years. So I can definitely see how it's happening that same way in Python for sure.
That's really interesting. Do we still have time for one question, or?
We've got 15 minutes left, so.
Okay, good. So one thing is this topic has taken the attention of even the government. How are you two thinking about whether individually or as representative of the project of these regulations that are coming out or standards that are trying to come out? Will they have any positive impact, or how does the community think about it?
So my day job is on Google's open source security team, and we do a lot of stuff, including supporting development of SigStore and other kind of what we think are software security best practices. I also work on some policy stuff. So I've been working with folks in the US government to figure out how the government is going to consume open source in a secure way. And the answer there I don't think is regulation, right? Like I don't think we're going to regulate our way out of this, which seems to be what the EU is trying to do right now.
Right.
But instead, I think the US government is one of the largest consumers of open source software. And by setting certain requirements for the way that they consume it and the way their contractors write it and produce it and consume it as well, they have the ability to sort of set the high bar for what it should be. So that's sort of the approach that I think is going to work. And at the very least, it will help them consume open source in a better way.
Yeah, totally. The biggest worry that I have about that, and this kind of like shows my roots as like a Rubyist who just thought open source was cool and weird and fun, right? Like we're aware why the Lucky Stiff wrote like a 1-page web app framework because he thought it would be fun, right? It's like, can I make an entire web app framework that fits in 2,000 bytes? And then he just like did completely bonkers like code golf things to make it happen because he thought it'd be cool. And like from an art project perspective, I think that maybe what will end up happening is we'll start to see kind of like a larger divergence between kind of like secure, audited, regulatorily acceptable open source and just like completely wild hobbyist side code art, basically, right? And historically in the Ruby community, those were actually the same thing, right? Like people were building giant commercial projects on top of weird art projects, and because so little concern was paid to the security of those things, it was fine. And so I suspect what's going to happen is we're going to see just kind of like, it'll be clearer whether something is a weird hobby art project or something is like an actual serious project.
Yeah, they'll have refused to turn on 2FA.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and going back to what Daniel said in our keynote, talking about the topic du jour, AI, is there a play there where Gen AI can help with some of these things that we see in a supply chain attack, or do we think that's just a technology look? When it comes to this, is it not a fit for it, right? Like, what do you two think about it?
I think there's some interesting stuff there. Like, I saw the like automated remediation stuff today. That's super cool. I think that would be an interesting use case, especially for people that might not have a security background. One thing that my team does, my team maintains OSS Fuzz, which fuzzes a bunch of open source projects. And we're starting some experiments now around generating fuzzing targets with LLMs. And that's super cool because fuzzing targets are like notoriously hard for humans to do, and doing them at scale would be really cool. So I think there's applications there, and maybe in some other places too.
Yeah, I think in the RubyGems world, I think the area where it would maybe be the most potentially helpful is like flagging stuff as fishy, right? Like I absolutely do not have confidence in an LLM to like tell me whether a security bug is fixed, but I do have confidence in an LLM saying like, hey, this base64 encoded wget looks kind of suspicious, and then be like, oh yeah, that's actually a problem. We should deal with that. So that's maybe a kind of like a triage or first tier, kind of like saving us some grunt work or filling in gaps where our like explicitly coded heuristics might potentially miss something. I think that's an area where it might potentially be helpful. But I guess I'm pretty skeptical of the idea that an LLM is going to like actually correctly fix a security issue.
I think it's maybe more likely that they'll lead
That
to
it will add
introducing
one.
more.
Yes, that is exactly what I mean.
Yeah. It would maybe be a solution for, but also a source for some as well.
It'll be it's snake eating its own tail.
Yeah, and I guess maybe looking forward, are there any standards or technologies? I mean, we just talked about Gen AI that maybe the two of you are excited about, or that you think are going to potentially help with this type of problem.
We've talked about SigStore a little bit. I'm all in on SigStore. We think it's a really good idea. It really does solve the problem that PGP kind of doesn't solve, which is like, how do you, learn to trust the identities of the things that are signing them?
Absolutely. RubyGems, and I don't know, maybe you're not even aware of this, RubyGems has had a PGP signature functionality that was basically like prototyped once, and we shipped it because why not? And then literally 10 years later, somebody came back and said, oh, hey, I just noticed that your signatures have never actually correctly verified the entire 10 years that they've existed.
Definitely believe that.
So that is fixed now, but it kind of revealed to us that there wasn't actually a point to having shipped it because it not only didn't work, but no one noticed for a decade. And so I am also very excited about SigStore as solving the problem of like, is this the software that the developer intended? And then at the same time, like my excitement is a little tempered by, in the Ruby ecosystem, every problem we've ever had was caused by something that the maintainer did intend. Right, like someone with the credentials of the developer wanted to put malware into that, or someone with the credentials for the package wanted to delete it, or, right, it's like supply chain security that doesn't come down to, I guess, but SigStore would absolutely solve that NPM CDN problem that we were just talking about from this morning.
Right.
So I hate to interrupt, but I want to make sure we have time for audience questions. Is there anything else anyone would like to share before we jump into the open Q&A?
I'll just say if you want to check out SigStore, it's sigstore.dev.
Yep.
Cool.
There you go.
Yeah, I would say if you want RubyGems to do a better job of noticing when bad things are happening, we would love developer or financial help from you, and you can check that out at rubycentral.org.
Awesome. Great conversation so far. Well, we have a few audience questions. This one I think is very interesting. You can choose who wants to answer. You can all answer. But what is the most interesting supply chain-based attack that you have seen? You can say skip, too.
Maybe it depends a lot on how you define interesting.
Or attack.
Yeah. Good point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think like, I think the most interesting thing was actually Log4j, which was not an attack, but the way, like, you could see the breadth of use.
Malicious configuration.
The way you had to respond to it, the way people still haven't addressed it. Like,
absolutely.
I think that is very interesting. But that was not an attack, right? That was just a bug.
Right, totally.
Yeah.
I think the class of attacks that really blew my mind when they finally like started happening was the attackers going to all of the work of monitoring expiring domains. I was just like, I would never in a million years have thought of that as a plan. Like, I'm gonna check every single domain, and I'm gonna hope that one of them is some gem I care about expiring so that I can get in.
And I think for me is not addressing like one particular scenario in itself, but it's similar to what you're talking about is some of the tactics changing, right? Mm-hmm. So we recently heard of an attack by a known attacker group that it's known for social engineering, but more targeting Windows environments. Now thinking about, wait a minute, I can social engineer and then use a supply chain attack against my victims. Mm-hmm. So that change of tactics by the attackers, just using supply chain as a vector, is pretty interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are one or two things this question says enterprise developer, but I would say every developer should be doing before using a new open source software package?
I do think there's a distinction to make there between enterprise and like hobby dev, right? Like in hobby dev, maybe you don't need to be concerned with some things, but
as long as you're not doing your hobby on your enterprise laptop.
Sure. Like one or two things before consuming a new open source package. Like, I hate to say like download counts or GitHub stars are a good metric for quality, they're a good proxy for quality, right? So
Sure, absolutely.
definitely look and see what the rest of the ecosystem is using. Maybe hold off on adopting that brand new thing that you just heard about in that Discord channel,
I mean, and if it's a hobby project, maybe you actually want to know how it works before you use it.
Maybe then by all means.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a little bit self-promoting, I guess, but one of the projects that Ruby Central supports is a website called the Ruby Toolbox. And it is just this incredible labor of love by a Ruby developer who was like, but I want to know how all of the libraries that do every category of thing compare to one another. And so it pulls in RubyGems stats, it pulls in GitHub stats, it pulls in like issues, rate of issues closed over time, it pulls in rate of releases over time, it has all of this and it's like, here are the 4 options if you want to add file uploads to your Rails app. And here is how they compare in releases, pull requests, issues, GitHub stars. And you can be like, oh, I see, this is a project that's been slowly but trickle maintained for many years. This is a project that's brand new. This is a project that's very old and kind of hasn't really been touched for several years. And if the thing that you need is something that the Ruby Toolbox already has coverage on, so absolutely my recommendation is to use that as the way that you can tell what the community situation for it is.
Yeah.
We get requests from time to time to curate or audit everything on PyPI, and kind of like CPAN does for Perl, right?
Yeah.
And it's just not feasible. First of all, with the scale of stuff on there, it's not feasible for RubyGems or npm. But the other thing is when you look at it, that's kind of already been done for you, right? The community has already kind of looked at what is out there and figured out what is best for them to use. And so sort of by aggregating that, you can help make better choices in what you consume.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think to finalize, because I think there is a difference call out there for enterprise developers, is use your CI as much as possible, right? So a little bit also of self-promoting, but we open source a tool called Datadog that will scan your npm or Python packages, not for vulnerabilities, but for malicious actions. So there are tools out there that you can use and just make them part of your CI.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any opinions on Sbombs, software bills of material?
Sbombs are not a silver bullet, is my opinion on Sbombs. I think they're a great tool for inventory, but the thing about Sbombs, and if you haven't heard of Sbombs, is a software bill of materials. It's kind of like an ingredient list for a single distributable piece of software. It's kind of like best effort, and there's no way to verify it, right? So you have to trust whatever produced that Sbomb that it was doing it correctly, and it was actually interrogating the software artifact that you think that Sbomb relates to and whether it's been accurate. So I think it's kind of similar to log files. You can sort of squint at an Sbomb and think of it as like a log file. Similar to that, I think it's going to go a long way towards observability and inventory and sort of knowing what you have in production, which for the government, for example, that's a huge use case, and they really need that, right? So they're pushing for it.
Yeah.
I don't think it solves all problems, though.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I feel like the biggest worry that I have about Sbombs is that people who are familiar with regular bills of materials will think that they're equivalent.
No.
And they're just not. But I do think that, kind of functionally, if you have a working lock file, you can kind of reformat it into as close to an Sbomb as it's possible to get using automated tools that we have today. But some really obvious gaps in that kind of observability are maybe this library vendors a copy of that library. And is that going to show up on an Sbomb? Nope.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully it would, I think, but it's kind of the point. But yeah, maybe.
But in practice, it will not today.
Yeah. But yeah, I think, we from a visibility standpoint, Sbombs can solve some things. I don't think operationally we've actually figured out what to do with them, right? Because a lot of people ask for them, but then when you ask what do you do with them, it's you just have them.
The same reason you want a log file, basically, right? If something goes wrong, we can look back at this and know whether we're in trouble or not.
Yeah. So it might be a solution still trying to find a problem to solve.
Well, we are just about out of time, so I think that's probably a great stopping point. Thank you very much. That was a fantastic discussion. I learned a lot. Hopefully everyone enjoyed it. Thank you for your questions, your participation. Please enjoy the rest of Dash, and if you want to learn more about AI, LLM related stuff, stay in this room for the next session. Let's give them a warm round of applause, please.
Thank you.